The HOA tried to bulldoze my land. Now they owe me $150,000. They trespassed, destroyed my fence, and tore up my garden, all because they thought they could steal my property. But I took them to court, exposed their corruption, and now? Their president resigned in disgrace, their board is crumbling, and they're paying me $150,000 in damages. They tried to erase my home. Now they're the ones who lost everything. Julian Reynolds had never needed much to be happy. His world was simple, steady, and untouched by the chaos of the outside. His countryside home, tucked away on the edge of a vast meadow, had been in his family for generations. It wasn't extravagant, nor did it turn heads, but it was his, a legacy passed down from his father, who had spent his final years tending to its land with care and devotion. The front yard was more than just a patch of earth. It was a sanctuary. Wildflowers bloomed in neat, intentional clusters, a small fountain gurgled softly, and a freshly restored white picket fence stood proudly along the property line, its paint still crisp from Julian's own hands. Every inch of the land held memories, his father's laughter, the quiet evenings spent under the sky, the feeling of belonging to something unshakable. That morning, the world outside his window was supposed to be still and familiar, just like every other day. Instead, he was pulled from sleep by a sound that did not belong, a deep, rumbling growl that made his stomach lurch. At first, his foggy mind tried to place it. Construction in the distance? A neighbor moving equipment? But as the low roar grew louder, something inside him turned cold. Throwing off his blanket, Julian grabbed a shirt, shoved it over his head, and moved toward the window. The moment his eyes landed on his front yard, his breath caught in his throat. A bulldozer was rolling straight through his garden. The machine's massive steel blade tore into the soft earth, uprooting the flower beds he had tended so carefully. Behind it, a group of men in construction uniforms moved with mechanical efficiency, ripping apart his picket fence as if it were nothing more than a pile of scrap wood. Some were marking the perimeter with stakes and spray paint, mapping out some invisible plan he had never agreed to. It looked like a war zone. His sanctuary turned to wreckage in mere minutes. For a second, Julian simply stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Then, the shock gave way to something stronger. Rage. His heart hammered in his chest as he bolted toward the door, his voice already rising in the back of his throat. This was his home, his land, and these people had no right to be here. Julian burst through the front door, his bare feet slamming against the wooden porch as he sprinted toward the wreckage of his yard. The bulldozer's massive treads chewed through the dirt, sending up clouds of dust as the blade plowed through what remained of his flower beds. His once pristine white picket fence lay scattered in pieces, the slats tossed carelessly into a pile like discarded trash. His chest tightened with fury, the surreal nightmare unfolding before him, fueling an anger that burned hotter with every second. "Hey, stop," he shouted, his voice cutting through the morning air like a whip. The workers barely reacted, continuing their destruction as if he were nothing more than a background noise. One of them, a burly man in an orange vest, finally glanced up, his expression impassive, almost bored. "Just doing our job, sir," the man said flatly before turning back to his clipboard. Julian's stomach knotted with rage. His yard was being torn apart, and these people acted like it was nothing, like they had the right. He stormed toward the bulldozer, stepping directly into its path. The operator hesitated, then finally let the machine idle, its engine growling like a caged beast, but Julian didn't back down. "This is my property," he snapped, his voice shaking with fury. "Who the hell gave you permission to do this?" The man in the vest sighed like he had dealt with a dozen men like Julian before. Flipping through his clipboard, he stopped on a page and held it up. "You'll have to take it up with the homeowner association, sir. We've been contracted to remove unauthorized structures and reclaim the land for community use." Julian's pulse thundered in his ears. Homeowner association? His house wasn't in any HOA. He had made sure of that before moving in. He had deliberately bought this land to avoid the bureaucratic overreach that HOAs were known for. "What homeowner association?" he demanded. "I don't belong to one." The man just shrugged. "Take it up with them. We've got our orders." Julian's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a mistake. This was theft. His home, his land, they were acting like it was theirs to take. and he wasn't going to let them. Julian stormed back inside, his pulse pounding in his ears. His hand shook as he snatched his phone off the counter, barely able to keep his fingers steady as he searched for the number to the Oakwood Ridge Homeowner Association. He had saved it months ago after hearing rumors that they were expanding their jurisdiction, but he had never imagined they would set their sights on his land. He hit dial, pacing the length of his kitchen as the phone rang. "Good morning, Oakwood Ridge Homeowners Association. This is Brenda speaking. How can I assist you?" The voice on the other end was bright and polite, the kind of forced cheerfulness that made his blood boil even more. "This is Julian Reynolds," he said, struggling to keep his anger in check. "There are people on my property right now, tearing up my yard. They say they're working for your HOA. What the hell is going on?" A brief pause. Then the sound of keys clacking on a keyboard. "One moment, sir." "Ah, yes. I see here that your property was recently annexed into the Oakwood Ridge Homeowner Association boundaries. The work crew was sent to address non-compliance issues." Julian's stomach twisted. "Annexed? You can't just annex my land. I never agreed to this." "Well, the board voted on it last month," Brenda said, as if that explained everything. "You should have received a notice in the mail." "I didn't receive anything," Julian snapped. "And even if I had, this is my property. You can't just take it over without my consent." "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not authorized to discuss this further," Brenda replied, her tone shifting from cheerful to clipped. "You'll need to speak with our president, Tony McCarthy. Would you like her contact information?" Julian gritted his teeth. That name was familiar. He had never met Tony McCarthy, but he had heard plenty stories of her overbearing control over the HOA, how she bullied homeowners into submission, how she treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. He scribbled down the number Brenda rattled off, then ended the call without another word. His heart pounded with frustration as he yanked open his filing cabinet, pulling out the thick folder of paperwork his father had left him when he inherited the house. Julian had always been careful about his legal records, deeds, surveys, tax documents, all neatly organized, proof that his land was independent from any HOA. He flipped through page after page, confirming what he already knew. His land had never been part of Oakwood Ridge. It shouldn't be now. That's when he made his second call, this time to the county land office. After waiting on hold, a woman named Danielle picked up. "County Land Records, how can I help you?" "I need to know if there's been a mistake," Julian said, forcing himself to stay calm. "The Oakwood Ridge Homeowner Association is claiming my property is under their jurisdiction, but I have the original deed that says otherwise." "Let me pull up the records," Danielle replied, her voice businesslike but patient. Julian listened to the sound of keys tapping as she searched. Then, after a moment, she sighed. "Okay, I see your property here." "Ah, here it is." A pause. "It looks like there was a recent update to the boundary map filed by Oakwood Ridge HOA. They expanded their jurisdiction last month." Julian's stomach dropped. "Expanded? Can they even do that without my consent?" Danielle hesitated. "Technically, HOAs can petition for boundary changes if they follow the proper legal process. But that requires notifying property owners and holding a vote." "Did you receive any notice?" "No," Julian said through gritted teeth. "Not a letter. Not an email. Not even a damn flyer on my door." "That's unusual," Danielle admitted. "They're required by law to notify property owners before any changes are finalized. If you didn't get anything, this could be a procedural violation. I can send you a copy of the boundary map and the filing documents they submitted. Would that help?" Julian grabbed a pen. "Yes. Email them to me. And can you tell me who approved the change?" "The filing was approved by the HOA board," Danielle explained. "It's signed off by their president, Tony McCarthy, and their legal counsel. But if you believe this was done improperly, you might need to consult a lawyer." Julian thanked her, hung up, and opened his laptop the moment the documents hit his inbox. His jaw clenched as he scanned the files. There it was, his property, outlined in bold red, suddenly part of the Oakwood Ridge HOA. And at the top of the approval form, Tony McCarthy's signature. The list of supposed violations on his land made him laugh out loud in disbelief. Unauthorized landscaping, a non-standard fence, improperly maintained yard ornaments. It was a joke. His garden and fence, which he had meticulously cared for, had been labeled non-compliant, just so they could justify taking his land. His fingers hovered over his phone screen. He needed help. Someone who knew property law inside and out. That's when he called Marissa Turner. Marissa had a reputation for being ruthless in court, the kind of attorney that HOAs hated to deal with. The moment he finished explaining the situation, he could hear the disbelief in her voice. "Let me get this straight," she said. "They annexed your property without notice, sent a crew to destroy your yard, and now they're claiming it was for HOA compliance?" "Exactly," Julian said, his hands tightening into fists. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. First, I'll draft a cease and desist letter to stop them from stepping foot on your property again. Second, we'll request the full procedural records for the annexation. If they skipped any steps, notice, hearings, votes, we'll have grounds to challenge it. And third, we're going to sue the hell out of them." Julian's rage sharpened into focus. "Do you think we have a case?" "Oh, we definitely have a case," Marissa said. "The real question is, how far is Tony McCarthy willing to go to cover this up?" Julian didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bulldozer ripping through his yard, the splintered remains of his fence, the smug indifference of the workers who had torn apart his home like it was nothing. But anger alone wouldn't win this fight. He needed evidence. By morning, Marissa had already fired off a cease and desist letter to the HOA, warning them that any further action on Julian's property would result in immediate legal consequences. But that was just the first step. They needed to dig deeper. A few hours later, Marissa called him back. "Good news. I got my hands on the HOA meeting minutes. You're going to want to hear this." Julian gripped his phone tighter as she continued. "So, the board held a vote to expand their jurisdiction, right? Well, turns out it wasn't unanimous. 2 members, one of them named Susan Grant, explicitly objected, saying it was illegal without owner consent." Julian felt a flicker of hope. So they knew they couldn't do this? "Oh, Tony McCarthy knew," Marissa said darkly. "She just didn't care. She railroaded the vote through anyway, dismissing concerns and claiming, 'We have the authority to act in the community's best interest.'" Julian let out a bitter laugh. "Unbelievable." "There's more," Marissa said. After the meeting, Susan Grant filed a written objection, stating that she didn't believe the annexation was enforceable. That document is now part of the official record. Julian's pulse quickened. "So we have proof they violated the process." "We do," Marissa confirmed. "But we're going to need Susan Grant to testify if we want to really drive it home." Julian hesitated. He didn't know Susan Grant, but she sounded like someone who had a conscience. If she was willing to speak up, it could completely destroy the HOA's case. "There's only one way to find out," Marissa said. "I'll reach out to her." The wait was excruciating, but later that day, Marissa called again with an update. "She agreed to meet," Marissa said. "She's not on the HOA board anymore, resigned right after the vote, but she's still a resident of Oakwood Ridge. She's willing to talk." Julian felt a wave of relief. "Let's do it." Marissa set up the meeting at her office. When Julian arrived, his nerves were on edge, but the moment he saw Susan Grant, he knew she was the key to taking down Tony McCarthy. She was a soft-spoken woman in her late 40s, but there was a quiet strength in her posture, a determination in her eyes that told Julian she wasn't someone who backed down easily. "I didn't agree with a lot of what Tony did," Susan admitted, her voice calm but firm. "She's authoritative, controlling, doesn't like to be questioned." Julian nodded. "Yeah, I've gotten that impression." Susan sighed, folding her hands on the table. "When she brought up the annexation, I knew it wasn't right. I told her we needed to notify the property owners and get their consent. She brushed it off, saying we had the authority. She even hinted that it was better to ask for forgiveness than permission." Marissa leaned forward. "And you submitted a written objection after the vote?" "I did," Susan confirmed. "I wanted it on record that I didn't support the decision. I couldn't stop them, but I wasn't going to be complicit." Marissa studied her for a moment before asking the big question. "Would you be willing to testify to that in court?" Susan hesitated. She glanced at Julian, her expression conflicted. "Tony's not someone you want to cross. She has a lot of influence in the neighborhood." Julian could tell she was afraid of retaliation. He didn't blame her. Tony McCarthy wielded power like a weapon, and people like her didn't take challenges lightly. But after a long moment, Susan straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I'll testify. What she did was wrong, and it's time someone held her accountable." Julian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you. That means a lot." With Susan's testimony secured, Marissa moved fast. She filed the lawsuit against the HOA, alleging trespassing, property destruction, procedural violations, emotional distress. The lawsuit demanded compensation for the damages to Julian's yard, as well as punitive damages to hold the HOA accountable for their actions. Then, the story exploded. Word spread like wildfire through the community, and within days, the local news picked it up. A reporter from the county newspaper reached out, and after some hesitation, Julian agreed to an interview. "This isn't just about me," Julian told the reporter. "It's about standing up to people who think they can abuse their power without consequences. HOAs have a purpose, but they need to follow the law like everyone else." The article ran with the headline, "Homeowner Fights Back Against Overreaching HOA." It detailed Julian's ordeal, the destruction of his property, and the legal battle ahead. The reaction was overwhelming. Many residents rallied behind him, praising him for taking a stand. Even some Oakwood Ridge homeowners began questioning Tony McCarthy's leadership, wondering just how far she was willing to go in the name of community standards. By the time the court date was set, Julian knew one thing for certain. Tony McCarthy had underestimated him, and she was about to regret it. The courthouse was smaller than Julian had expected, but the weight pressing down on his shoulders made it feel massive. He walked in alongside Marissa, keeping his face calm even though his pulse pounded in his ears. Across the room, Tony McCarthy sat with her attorney, a sharp-suited man who looked like he had spent years perfecting the smug smirk on his face. Marissa leaned toward Julian as they took their seats. "Stay calm, don't react to anything they say. We've got a solid case, and Tony's overreach will speak for itself." Julian nodded, forcing himself to breathe evenly. This was it. The hearing began with the HOA's attorney standing up, his voice smooth and authoritative as he painted a picture of the Oakwood Ridge Homeowner Association as a responsible organization simply trying to maintain property values and community standards. He claimed that the annexation of Julian's property was conducted properly, that the actions taken on his land were necessary to bring it into compliance with HOA regulations, and that Julian's resistance was an attempt to disrupt the harmony of the neighborhood. Julian clenched his fists under the table, his jaw tightening with every carefully constructed lie. Then it was Marissa's turn. She stood with deliberate confidence, her voice sharp and unwavering as she outlined the key facts. Julian's property had never been part of the HOA. The annexation was conducted without proper notice or consent. The destruction of his yard was a clear case of trespassing. She pulled up the original deed, showing that Julian's land had always been independent. Then she introduced the HOA's own meeting minutes, proving that Tony had ignored objections from board members and forced the vote through without legal backing. Then came the real turning point. Susan Grant took the stand. She walked to the witness stand with a quiet, determined air, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she answered Marissa's questions. "When the annexation was proposed, I objected," Susan said, her voice clear and steady. "I told Tony McCarthy that it was illegal without notifying the property owners. She dismissed my concerns, insisting that we had the authority to act in the community's best interest. When I tried to push back, she shut me down and forced the vote through anyway." The HOA's attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting that her resignation from the board was motivated by personal grievances rather than principle. But Susan didn't waver. "I resigned because I refused to be part of an HOA that disregards the rights of property owners. What Tony did was wrong, and I couldn't stand by and let it happen." Julian watched as the judge took notes, her expression unreadable but focused. The cracks in the HOA's defense were widening, and they weren't done yet. Finally, it was Julian's turn. He took the stand, his heart pounding as he looked out across the courtroom. Marissa guided him through his testimony, letting him explain in detail how the HOA had violated his rights, destroyed his property, and disregarded every legal requirement in their attempt to take control of his land. He described waking up to the sound of machinery, watching his garden and fence being ripped apart without warning. He spoke about the frustration of being ignored, the anger of realizing that his land had been stolen out from under him, and the exhaustion of fighting against people who thought they could get away with it. Then came the HOA's attorney, his smirk returning as he prepared to dismantle Julian's claims. "Mr. Reynolds," he began, "isn't it true that your property's fencing and landscaping could be considered out of step with the aesthetic of the Oakwood Ridge community?" Julian held his ground, his voice steady. "My property isn't part of the Oakwood Ridge community. It never has been." The attorney's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he pressed on. "But surely you can understand how an unregulated property could impact the value of surrounding homes?" Julian exhaled sharply, shaking his head. What affects property values is a homeowner association president who oversteps her authority, ignores legal procedures, and tries to control land she doesn't own. What affects property values is an HOA that thinks it can take whatever it wants without consequence. The attorney shifted, glancing at Tony, whose expression had darkened considerably. Julian had struck a nerve. Marissa closed with a powerful statement, laying out the blatant disregard for property rights, the fabricated violations, and the sheer arrogance of the HOA's actions. This case isn't just about property lines. It's about accountability. HOAs are meant to serve their communities, not impose their will through intimidation and deception. Mr. Reynolds isn't asking for anything unreasonable. He's asking for justice. The judge sat back, her expression neutral as she nodded. Court will recess while I deliberate. Julian barely breathed as the judge left the bench. The room was silent except for the low murmur of voices. Tony McCarthy sat stiffly, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if trying to control her temper. The HOA attorney glanced at her but said nothing. They knew. They had lost control of the narrative. Now, all they could do was wait for the ruling. And Julian wasn't going to back down now. The courtroom was silent when the judge returned, her expression unreadable as she settled back into her seat. Julian felt his heart hammering, every muscle in his body tense as he prepared for the decision that would determine whether he had fought for nothing or if justice would finally be served. He barely breathed as the judge cleared her throat and looked over the room. The evidence presented in this case demonstrates that the Oakwood Ridge Homeowner Association exceeded its legal authority in annexing Mr. Reynolds' property. She began, her voice firm but even. The annexation was conducted without proper notification or consent from the property owner, rendering it invalid. Furthermore, the actions taken on Mr. Reynolds' property, including the destruction of his fence, landscaping, and other personal property, constitute trespassing and unlawful property damage. Julian's fingers dug into the edge of the table, his breath catching in his chest. The court orders the Oakwood Ridge Homeowner Association to pay restitution for all damages to Mr. Reynolds' property, as well as additional punitive damages to account for the egregious nature of their actions. The total award is set at $150,000. Julian exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping as the tension bled from his body. He had won. He had won. From the corner of his eye, he saw Tony McCarthy go rigid, her jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. The HOA attorney swallowed hard, his once smug expression replaced by something far more uncertain. They had gambled and lost, and they knew it. The judge continued. Additionally, the Oakwood Ridge HOA is hereby instructed to cease all enforcement actions related to Mr. Reynolds' property. Any future attempts to exert control over land that is not legally within HOA jurisdiction will be considered a violation of this ruling and may result in further legal consequences. Julian's chest tightened, not with fear, but with satisfaction. It was over. The HOA had tried to steal his home, bully him into submission, and erase his rights. And now they had to pay. Court was adjourned, and as soon as the judge stepped away, the room erupted into murmurs. Julian stood slowly, turning just in time to catch Tony McCarthy's furious glare. For the first time, she looked uncertain, even shaken. She had ruled over the HOA like a queen, untouchable and feared, but today, she had lost. And judging by the whispers among the other HOA members in attendance, she had lost more than just a lawsuit. Julian didn't gloat. He didn't say a word as Tony stormed out of the room, shoving past the HOA board members who suddenly seemed far less loyal than before. But he didn't have to. The damage was done. In the following weeks, the fallout was swift and brutal. The news of the court ruling spread quickly, and Tony McCarthy's once iron grip on the Oakwood Ridge HOA began to crumble. Homeowners who had once followed her without question now demanded answers. Why had she risked their money on a lawsuit they were bound to lose? Why had she fabricated violations? How many other shady decisions had she made? Under mounting pressure from residents, Tony McCarthy was forced to resign as HOA president. Her reputation was shattered. Julian, meanwhile, wasted no time rebuilding. The settlement money went straight into repairing his land, restoring his garden, rebuilding his white picket fence, and making sure that not a single trace of the HOA's destruction remained. But more than that, he made one final change, one that ensured nothing like this would ever happen again. He installed security cameras around his property, set up clear warning signs, and made it very clear to anyone who might try that his land was his and no one else's. For the first time in months, Julian stood at the edge of his yard, looking over the land his father had left him. The scars of the ordeal would take time to fade, but for the first time since that bulldozer had torn through his front yard, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. The morning air smelled like fresh cut wood and damp earth as Julian ran a hand over the smooth white slats of his newly rebuilt picket fence. The fresh paint gleamed under the sunlight, standing tall where the HOA had once reduced it to splinters. His garden was finally whole again, bursting with color, the wildflowers swaying in the gentle breeze. The small fountain his father had installed years ago trickled softly, a quiet reminder of the history that had nearly been stolen from him. It had taken weeks to undo the damage, but standing here now, looking over the land that was finally his again, Julian felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The battle had been long, exhausting, and at times, infuriating, but he had won. And more importantly, he had made sure they would never try this again. Along the perimeter of his property, new security cameras were mounted in strategic spots, each one covering an angle that had once been vulnerable. A clear sign stood at the entrance of his driveway: private property, trespassers will be prosecuted. It was a message, not just to the HOA, but to anyone who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. The ruling against Oakwood Ridge HOA had sent shockwaves through the community, and Julian had quickly become something of a local symbol. Homeowners from all over the county, some still fighting their own battles against corrupt HOAs, began reaching out, asking for advice, sharing their own horror stories. The more he listened, the more he realized just how many people had been bullied, manipulated, and intimidated by power-hungry homeowner associations. So Julian made a decision. He wasn't just going to move on, he was going to make sure no one else had to go through what he did. He started by sharing his story. First with local news, then with online communities, real estate groups, and forums dedicated to property rights. He warned people about how easily an HOA could twist the rules, about the loopholes they exploited, and about the importance of knowing your legal rights before signing anything. He gave advice, helped others research their property deeds, and even connected homeowners with lawyers like Marissa Turner, who had been instrumental in his own case. Before he knew it, his story had gone viral. The phrase, "pulling a Julian Reynolds," started popping up in discussions about fighting back against overreaching HOAs, and he began receiving messages from people across the country. Some just wanted to thank him. Others wanted to know how to start their own legal battles. It was surreal. He had never set out to be an activist, but somehow, the fight that had nearly cost him his home had turned him into something more, a voice for people who had been silenced, ignored, and steamrolled by the very organizations that were supposed to protect their communities. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch, watching the sun dip low over the meadow, his phone buzzed with a new message. "Hey, Julian. Just wanted to say thanks. I fought my HOA and won. Wouldn't have done it without hearing your story. Appreciate you, man." Julian smiled. The battle for his own home was over, but the fight wasn't. And for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he was meant to be,